Capitol Report is a production of Senate Media Services.
On this week's program, we're taking a closer look at the work of the Legislative Task Force on access to affordable childcare. We'll also talk with MinnPost reporter Briana Bierschbach about the constitutional amendment on this year's ballot. Stay tuned for this and more on this week's Capitol Report. Election day is nearly upon us, and one additional item on the statewide ballot is a constitutional amendment that would place the power to set legislative salaries in the hands of a 16-member citizen committee appointed by the governor and the Minnesota Supreme Court Chief Justice. Joining me in the studio to discuss the particulars of this amendment is MinnPost political reporter Briana Bierschbach. Welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So how did this come to be on the ballot?
Well, legislative pay is something that in the Constitution currently legislators have to set. So it periodically comes up at the Capitol. Legislators are currently paid $31,000 a year, about with per diem and some other things on top of that, but that hasn't been raised since 1999. It's come up in the Capitol since then, but every time people try to raise it, the idea comes back with, well, why would you raise your own pay? Why do you think you need a pay raise? Also, some people think that the act of legislators voting to raise their own pay is inherently a conflict of interest. So the discussion came up in 2013 in a DFL-controlled legislature. Should we ask the voters if this process should be changed? Should we take it out of the hands of legislators and give it to an independent commission instead?
So one thing that's unusual is often when there's a constitutional amendment, various coalitions form for and against, and you'll see lawn signs and bumper stickers and billboards. That hasn't happened for this amendment. It's unusual. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I don't think we know exactly why, but yeah, it's dramatically different than 2012, for instance, when we had two constitutional amendments on the ballot to ban gay marriage and also voter ID. We saw tons of money being spent, a huge number of activists and groups forming on both sides of that issue. The thought is, with this issue, is that people don't necessarily want to talk about it. Even people who might oppose it and might bring it up as a issue when they knock on doors don't necessarily want to officially campaign against this, because a lot of legislators do think there needs to be a pay raise. A lot of legislators do think it is a conflict of interest, and a lot of legislators didn't necessarily oppose this when it was passed in 2013. So there might be kind of a handshake agreement behind the scenes that campaigns weren't going to form to campaign against this officially, is the thought.
So you've talked about it a little bit, some of the reasons for, but what are, in general, reasons to be for this amendment and reasons to be against, to make legislators continue to vote on their own pay?
Well, if you would ask Senator Ken Eakin, he said the conflict of interest is the big thing. Legislators shouldn't be voting to raise their own pay or lower their pay, for that matter. I don't think that's ever happened, but it can happen, certainly, if legislators want to do that.
Sure.
But I think that in his mind, it's a conflict of interest. Let's remove that. Other people do believe legislators need a pay raise, or at least that an independent commission should look at other factors other than politics, inflation, cost of living, things like that have gone up since 1999. And in theory, that's what this group would do. People who oppose it say that it's just going to be an automatic pay increase for legislators, and that it's been disguised as an independent commission, but really it's just to give legislators a pay boost. Others say it will bring partisanship into the process. Now, legislators are already partisan, but the members of the commission would split between the Republican and the Democratic Party, so some people oppose it on that grounds as well.
And so what have other states done in terms of how they calculate what their legislators are paid?
Yeah, every state does it differently. There are about 20 states that also have an independent citizens commission that does something similar to what the constitutional amendment is proposing, but they have different powers. Some can suggest pay, but then it has to go to the voters. Arizona has a system like that. So it hasn't been changed or raised in a little while because the voters get the ultimate authority. Some commissions have to kick the recommendations to the legislature. So in the end, the legislature gets a vote. But states like California and Washington have unilateral power. And in a lot of states that have more power and more flexibility on the commission, they have raised pay. Alaska put a similar constitutional amendment on the ballot in 2009, and that after that was passed, or in 2008, I'm sorry. And in 2009, they raised pay by 50%, 25 to 50,000. So now that is where they sit with their pay raises, but they hadn't had their pay raised in more than 20 years. So it felt like a pretty big issue in that state. And other states have done that too.
Minnesota actually already has a little-known council that recommends legislator pay. What was their most recent recommendation?
Yeah, it's a small group, and they don't actually have any authority to tell legislators to do this or that. They can recommend based on some of the things we talked about before, inflation, cost of living, things like that. And they recommended that legislators be paid about 30% of the governor's salary, and the governor makes about $120,000 a year, or maybe it was 33%. So that would be about $40,000, where legislators make about 31 right now.
So that would be a significant
It would be
change.
about a $10,000 pay bump, which I think some people would be a sticker shock. We don't really know what this independent commission is going to do, if they're going to start with those recommendations, if it's voted on by the voters as well, or if they'll go and start from scratch. They do also have the power to lower pay, which has been done in some states. California saw a commission lower its pay. They were being paid a lot more.
Oh, that's right. I read that. There were budget cuts, and so they decided their legislature needed a pay cut as well.
Yeah, they needed to feel the pain of the budget cuts too. So they went down from over 100,000, their full-time legislature, to I think just slightly under. Now those have been restored over the years. Michigan also saw a pay cut from its legislative pay commission. So it does happen, and it could happen in Minnesota too.
And it's important to note that Minnesota is considered a part-time legislature. How many former legislators have cited salary as a reason for not continuing to serve?
Sure. I mean, quite a few. I don't know an exact number, but I've talked to several over the years. Brandon Peterson, former senator from in the suburbs, and he said he had a young family. He started when he was younger, and as time went on, the pay just wasn't enough as his family grew, and he couldn't hold down or find a good enough flexible part-time job because you're in session 5 months of the year, and after that you're campaigning or you're doing constituent services. It's just not a flexible enough job. Another House Representative, Larry Hosch, told me that he also had to, because of family and the distance and the pay, had to find a different job.
One last thing, if people don't fill out the ballot at all, is that a yes or no vote then?
It is a no vote.
Okay.
The constitutional amendments are the majority of yes votes in the total ballots cast. So if you don't vote in it at all, it's essentially a no vote in Minnesota.
Briana, I want to thank you for coming in today and for talking about this, and I'll see you around.
Thanks for having me.
Voting on changing the state constitution gives the Minnesota public a more direct role in decision-making. Producer Jon Brune looks at the process of enacting a constitutional amendment in Minnesota.
The Minnesota Constitution is a living document, frequently adjusting to the political landscapes of over 1.5 centuries. Hundreds of amendments have been proposed since the early years of statehood, many of which have been enacted. Changing the state constitution is designed to be more difficult than passing typical legislation. It is meant to allow the Minnesota public to play a more direct role in the decision-making process. And while there are many similarities between enacting constitutional amendments and passing typical legislation, there are also significant differences.
On that motion, all those in favor say aye. Opposed, nay. Motion prevails.
The process that's required for the enactment of a constitutional amendment begins a lot like the ordinary legislative process. A member of either chamber might think of an idea, a way they want to change the Constitution. They have that drafted and prepared in bill form, and it's then introduced just like a bill. And each chamber would need to take action on that bill the same way it passes ordinary legislation. In other words, the requirements for 3 readings on different days, etc., all the other requirements for passage of legislation apply. Once both chambers have passed the proposed legislation, the proposed amendment in the form of, in bill form, things begin to differ from the ordinary legislative process. Typically, the bill is submitted to the governor for the governor's approval. That step is symbolic only. Governors do not have veto authority over proposed constitutional amendments. That has been firmly established in Minnesota. There's been a long tradition of placing those amendments proposed amendments before the governor to allow the governor to weigh in effect, demonstrate additional support for the proposed amendment and provide an opportunity for comment, perhaps, in case there is some difference of opinion. And after the governor has had the opportunity to weigh in and express an opinion on the merits of the proposed amendment, the Secretary of State then ensures that the proposed amendment is placed before the voters of the state in the form of a question that will appear on the next general election ballot.
Determining the number of votes required for a constitutional amendment to pass is an unusual process. It also increases the difficulty of amending the Constitution.
When it comes to the general election, the very important distinction there is that there is a supermajority requirement in effect for passage of the amendment. And what that means is that a simple majority of the total number of voters voting in the election must vote for the amendment in order for it to become law. If there are 1,000 voters voting in the election, we know that 501 votes would be a simple majority of those voting in the election. And then let's set aside the proposed amendment and say that only 900 voters decide to cast a ballot or decide to vote on the proposed amendment. Ordinarily, a simple majority would be 451 votes, half plus one of the 900 votes. That would be insufficient to pass the proposed constitutional amendment. You'd need 501 votes out of the 900 in order to pass the proposed amendment. Anyone who goes into the voting booth on the day of the general election and doesn't vote for the amendment or against it, in effect, has voted against that amendment. Not voting is treated like a no vote because of the construction of the supermajority requirement for passage of the proposed amendment. In effect, the supermajority requirement is a floating number. We don't know exactly what that supermajority requirement will be for passage of the amendment until all votes have been tallied and we know how many people voted in the election. So there are some barriers that make it, obviously it's a complex and lengthy process. It's not designed to happen easily or overnight. Those are the very important parts to remember. Another small nuance is that when the legislature proposes the amendment, it can also pass legislation, amendments to statutes and other enabling legislation that will take effect only if the proposed amendment is adopted. So if the voters pass it, that can then act like a trigger to enact further legislation necessary to implement the proposed changes.
Once a majority of those voting in the election approve an amendment, the results are reviewed by a state canvassing board, and the amendment takes effect immediately or at a time specified by that amendment. There is one other way the Minnesota State Constitution can be amended. However, it's a rare procedure that has never been fully implemented.
There is an alternative process that is even more complicated and is established within the Constitution. It is available, but has not been used. And it basically allows for the calling of a constitutional convention to, in effect, rewrite all or significant parts of the Constitution. It's much more complex. 2/3 of each chamber of the legislature has to agree to call for the convention. Delegates are then chosen in a manner that the legislature would provide by law. We know that from the Constitution, there have to be as many delegates as there are members of the state House of Representatives. And the Constitution has to occur within 3 months after the decision to call for it. That could involve, as I said, a total rewrite of the state constitution. I think that the idea behind it is where wholesale change would be required, this might be the best method for accomplishing that rather than a series of smaller ballot questions that eventually become complex if they're trying to accomplish many different things. Once again, once the convention completes its work, the proposed set of changes has to be placed before the voters in order for those changes to become law.
In the wake of two high-profile fatal shootings of black men by Minnesota police, Governor Dayton recently announced the establishment of the Council on Law Enforcement and Community Relations. The council will make policy recommendations to improve relations and build trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve.
I've heard it said these are challenging times for law enforcement officers. I've also heard it said there's great opportunity here to work together. Recent tragic events in Minnesota and around the country have tested the relationship between law enforcement and the communities that they serve. It is essential that there be strong trust between law enforcement and those communities. That trust is built on relationships and an understanding of each other's concerns about the present and our vision for the future.
Law enforcement should reflect and be responsive to the cultural, racial, and gender diversity of the communities that they serve. This is not an easy task, and a multi-pronged approach will be needed to reestablish trust and build relationships.
I believe all policing is done at the neighborhood level, and each neighborhood is unique, so the expectations of citizens in neighborhoods are going to vary. What works in one neighborhood may not work in another neighborhood. Having said that, I don't think this stuff is really all that complicated. For policing to be effective, there must be trust between residents and the police. For there to be trust, there must first be a relationship. And in my mind, policing is all about building relationships.
Depending upon where you live, finding high-quality yet affordable childcare may be a struggle. The Legislative Task Force on Access to Affordable Childcare, signed by Governor Dayton in May of this year, is tasked with proposing legislative solutions for this complex dilemma. They've been holding meetings, and here are some recent highlights.
Over time, I think we're going to need to wrestle with the compensation issues that continue to go forward with any business that's trying to be successful. And Ms. Keller's references to the coaching and the consultation around business supports such that a business owner, a family child care provider, or a center director can fully take advantage of the funding streams that are in place, along with ensuring that the educational opportunities are being nurtured for the young children in their care.
You've got child care providers that are going to go out of business because they aren't generating a level of income to support themselves, irrespective of what they're receiving from these other streams of income. And so to the point earlier made by the presenter about business development and looking at a P&L, education and the quality experience only gets you so far. It makes you feel good, but it doesn't pay the bills. It doesn't keep the lights on in the child care center. And so when you say that we're going to have to start or look to wrestle with this, I think that time's right now.
Rep. Albright, you called the question. You know, we want people to get more education, but that doesn't allow them to charge higher rates. It doesn't allow them to have a better profit and loss statement at the end of the day. It is better for kids, and it's better for our economy, and it's better for the economic future of Minnesota, because all the research we have says that programs have to be high quality in order to get those returns on investments. So you have to have the educated staff, but it's a real conundrum in terms of how that translates to wages and compensation for people in the field. What we really need is to stop nipping at the edges of the problem. I like food, so I always think of things in food, and I feel like we're talking about legitimate issues with licensing and training and delivery systems, but I feel like we got a big pan of burned lasagna, and all of those issues are totally legitimate, but are kind of nipping some of the burned edges away, and we're not getting to the heart of the meal, which is the workforce, the providers, and without more financial resources, we're not going to be able to move this needle. And I feel like the lasagna is getting old and it's getting cold, and by the time we get to it, we're all going to have food poisoning, which is not good.
You were just watching some highlights from a recent hearing of the Legislative Task Force on Access to Affordable Childcare. I recently had the opportunity to talk with the task force co-chair, Senator Melissa Wiklund, and I began by asking her about two key issues that emerged from the hearing. There were two issues that seemed to emerge. One is securing sufficient wages for the workers and the providers, and the second is adding more public dollars to assure high quality childcare services. So are dollars really at the heart of the matter?
Well, I think they are one of the biggest factors that we're facing right now. There are a lot of studies that show what makes up a high quality care setting for children that are ages 0 to 5. And we know what it takes to provide those high quality features in family daycare or in child care centers. But we also know that along with that comes costs for the provider to be able to provide the kind of environment that's necessary, as well as paying wages that are, reflect the quality of the work that they do. Our public dollars have not kept up with funding at the levels that are necessary, and that is why you hear such a repeated call for additional funds. Our reimbursement rates for providers who accept the public subsidy money, the CCAP, that's referred to as CCAP, those rates are still set at a level that reflects a 2011 wage study. And so they haven't really been adjusted in many years. And they also are set at only the 25th percentile of the rates across the different areas. So not only are they behind in terms of the years that have gone by, they also are set relatively low compared to what the overall what the higher rates that some providers are able to charge. So I think that all points to a need for additional public funding.
Okay. The Center for Rural Policy and Development published a study, and we heard testimony last night about this. They published the figure that more than 1/4 of in-home family providers closed between 2006 and 2015. It's slightly different for Greater Minnesota than it is in the cities, but what's your understanding as to why so many of those in-home providers are closing?
Well, I think we heard that there are multiple reasons for closing. Some can be attributed just to people who are getting older and retiring, just like in any work area. But also there are a lot of stresses on providers if they aren't able to make enough money serving the number of children that they're allowed to serve. It really is a very high demand profession. We hear many of the providers talk about having 12-hour days, 5 days a week. They have a huge responsibility. Taking care of children is a huge responsibility, and
it takes a lot of energy.
It takes a lot of energy.
Yeah.
And they're working with children in a great range of developmental stages. Infants take much different care than a 5-year-old. So I think that the combination of that, along with opportunities outside that may be, more attractive in terms of wages. One thing she pointed out last night, that some areas have higher paying jobs, maybe $15, $16 an hour, and they're maybe making $10 an hour in their home daycare situation. And it's hard to expect someone to stay in that profession if they're able to work for a much higher wage.
The home-based providers are also declining in the cities, but there's been an increase in the daycare centers. Is there an effort to keep both kinds of care available?
Well, I think there is an effort to keep both kinds of care available. We've heard in our task force meetings that parents and families and providers want to be able to offer all different options to families. Some families like to have a home setting. They feel that that's best for their children, and others like the opportunities that center-based care offers. And I think it's important to have all options available. The rural Minnesota person, she also said that a lot of the maybe immigrant families would like to have more family-based childcare available, then that's who they feel more comfortable leaving their children with, and also people who maybe speak their language and are able to talk or use their own cultural background in their care.
Right, which kind of goes to the culturally appropriate childcare. I know the task force has been talking about that. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, we feel that one of the higher need areas is for care for immigrants or children who speak another language at home. And in order to do that, providers, if they're of the same culture as the family, then obviously they have that background and experience to draw on. But there's a greater need than what's available. So how do providers can they learn techniques to provide more appropriate cultural experiences for the children that they're caring for? Can we take advantage of the fact that they speak multiple languages? I think that's an asset that kids can bring with them into their educational experiences all through their lives, to have that dual language experience. So we have assistance from some of the agencies in the area who are working with providers to strengthen not only their culturally specific practices, but then also how do they become better teachers and support their children in other ways that maybe they don't have experience in.
So one last question for you. If workers are concerned about their childcare situation, or they experience a childcare crisis and can't even go to work, what is the employer responsibility in this? And is this something that the task force is looking at?
Yes, we've talked about it, and I think it is something that we need to always keep in mind, along with the idea that if the public is going to be assisting, providing public dollars, I think we should also look at how can we partner, or how can employers partner with families to help, since it is such a large expense for families. So we've heard examples of specific employers who actually have built daycare centers basically for their employees, and then they offer subsidized rates for their employees. I mean, that's one option that's very specific to an employer, but I think there's got to be other ways that employers can engage their employees to find out what their needs are, and how can they provide either financial subsidies or scheduling, help with scheduling perhaps. That make it easier for families to find care that's affordable.
Senator Wiklund, we have to stop there. We'll look forward to the recommendations of your task force, and thank you for coming today.
Great, you're welcome.
Join us again next week as we delve into more topics affecting Minnesotans. I'm Shannon Loehrke, and on behalf of all of us at Senate Media Services, thanks for watching.